Let me show you 6 easy ways on how to seam any crochet projects. The most basic and easiest seam to make is the single crochet seam stitch. This seam is perfect for joining the top of any stitch or through the row side of any post stitch. If you plan on working through the loops of the stitch, make sure to find that last row with the V-shaped stitches at the top and not the foundation bottom chain row. And when you're working on the row side, you'll just have to adjust your stitch width accordingly. Now let me show you how it's done. First, you place the top rows sandwiched together like this. And if you have a bigger project, it's always ideal to secure both pieces with stitch markers placed at the end and several in the middle of the row where you plan to work on. Now for demonstration purposes, I'll be using a contrasting yarn, but of course you should always use the same hook size and yarn as your current project. Now you insert your hook through the first stitch through both loops, and again through the back first stitch through both loops. You'll drop a loop, and for me, I prefer to chain 1 to secure my stitch. Now to start my seam, I'll insert my hook through the first stitch again on both pieces. Make sure to carry the excess tail in front of your hook. This will just give you one less end to weave. You'll drop a loop, yarn over and pull through both loops. And this will be your first single crochet seam stitch. Now you'll continue working the single crochet stitch through each stitch through both pieces, and don't forget to bring the excess tail in front of your crochet hook, and you'll work your single crochet around the yarn tail. Now you'll repeat the single crochet seam stitch all the way across. And once you've reached your last stitch, you'll go ahead and work that final single crochet seam stitch, drop a loop, yarn over, and pull through all loops. And this is your excess tail, which you can pull and snip off later on. This is how the front side should look like. You should have an even horizontal line across. And on the wrong side, this is how it should look like. It has a slight bump to the stitch that you just made. It does not have a smooth finish, so just keep that in mind when you're choosing which seam to use for your next project. And of course, if you're using the same yarn color, this stitch will not be visible. Now we'll be working on the post side of the row. Just like how we worked on the top side of the stitch, we'll sandwich both pieces together. You'll place a stitch marker at the end and anywhere in the middle of the row that you're working on. Now, in order to work this stitch, you'll have to work even stitches throughout the entire row. So first, you'll insert your hook through the most visible stitch space at the corner of the row. You'll drop a loop. You'll chain 1 to secure. Now I'll go back and insert my hook through the same stitch. I'll pick up the excess tail and place it in front of my hook. I'll drop a loop and work that single crochet stitch. Now, in order to work the next single crochet stitch, I'll find the next closest visible space that is wide enough as how a single crochet stitch should be. I'll insert my hook and work that single crochet stitch. And don't forget to work around the excess tail. Now you'll just be repeating the single crochet stitch while working even stitches across. And on your last stitch, you'll work that last single crochet seam stitch and chain 1 to secure. And don't forget to snip off the excess tail. And this is how the wrong side should look like, and the right side should look something like this. Now let me show you how to work the slip stitch seam through the top and through the side. Let's place both pieces together with the stitches at the top. Now if you're working a bigger project, it's always ideal to use a stitch marker and place them at the corner of each side and several in the middle. I'll just align my stitches together before placing my stitch marker. It is always best to do this for every project. Now you insert your hook through both pieces through the first stitch. You'll draw up a loop and you'll chain one. This will be considered your first slip stitch. And for the slip stitch method, we will not be able to work around the excess tail. Now, just like how you'll do a regular slip stitch, you'll insert your hook through the second stitch through both pieces. You'll draw up a loop and you'll slip stitch through the loop on your hook. Now you'll just be repeating the slip stitch through each stitch all the way across. On your last stitch, you'll work that final slip stitch and a chain one to secure. This stitch also has that little bump to the joint, but it also has a really nice chain stitch across. This will be the wrong side of your work, and the right side should look very similar to the single crochet stitch. You'll have horizontal lines across. Now let's do the post row together. You'll place the row side or the post side together. We'll secure them with stitch markers. Now for the row side, you'll insert your hook through the most visible space at the corner of the row. You'll draw up a loop. And you'll work that one chain. This will be considered your first slip stitch. Now you insert your hook through the next visible space, and the width should be as wide as a regular slip stitch should be. You wouldn't want to insert your hook too near or too far. Now you'll continue working each chain or each slip stitch all the way across. And you'll chain one to secure. This is how the back should look like. You'll be able to see the chain-like stitch on one side and horizontal stitch on the other side. As mentioned before, this stitch is not smooth and it will come with a bump along the joint. And this is how the right side should look like. For this next seam, I'll be showing you how to work the surface slip stitch seam method. Now say for example you're planning to seam a pocket or a smaller crochet piece on top of a larger piece like a body panel for example. You can also choose to use this stitch if you want the slip stitch chain to be visible for aesthetic purposes. Now just like any other seaming, we'll secure them with stitch markers. Now you'll insert your hook through that first stitch and through the back piece. It can be through a stitch or it can also be through a post. You'll insert your hook and drop a loop. You won't be working a chain one for this method. Next, you'll insert your hook through the next stitch and you'll drop a loop from the yarn at the back. And you'll work that slip stitch. You'll continue to insert your hook through the following stitch. You'll drop a loop and work that slip stitch. When I mentioned earlier about aesthetics, you can also choose to use a different colored yarn in order to see the chain-like joint more prominently, and that is what's so great about this seam style. It is also a very secure and sturdy stitch to use. And on your last stitch, you'll work the chain 1 to secure, and this is the front side of your work with that really pretty chain stitch, and it is also a flat stitch. And the back should look something like this, and if you open up the two pieces, you should see a joint like this. For our next seam, this surface chain seam can only work on the stitch side, and ideally it should have the same number of stitches on both pieces like a granny square or a blanket. Now you'll place the stitch row side by side, and if you have a larger project, go ahead and secure them with stitch markers. Now you'll insert your hook through the back loop of the first stitch on the right side. As you can see, the V-shaped loop here, and this is where you'll be inserting your hook, and you'll do the same thing on the opposite side. You'll find that back loop on that first stitch and insert your hook. Now you'll take your working yarn and you'll drop the loop from the top of your project, and now you have a loop on your hook. Next, you'll insert your hook through the back loop of the second stitch on the right side and again on the left side. You'll drop a loop through all loops on your hook. Now you should be able to see a chain beginning to form. Now let's do that together again. You'll find the next back loop on the right side. You'll insert your hook, and again on the left side through the back loop, and always make sure that your working yarn is under your hook before inserting your hook into the next stitch. You'll continue this back loop stitch on both pieces while drawing up a loop and working up chains all the way across. On your last stitch, you'll chain 1 to secure your work. This stitch is very similar to the surface slip stitch method, which you can also use with a different colored yarn, and is also a very flat and secure stitch. The only difference is that the stitch is worked through the back loop of each stitch. Now let's leave our crochet hooks behind and start learning how to use the yarn needle, or also known as a tapestry needle or a darning needle. This needle typically has a larger eyelet and a blunt tip, perfect for working with fibrous yarns. You can also work on any side. You can choose the stitch side or the row side for this seam. This whip stitch is a very common stitch used in most projects, but I personally feel that this seam is not very secure if it's not done correctly. Now let's secure our two pieces together with our stitch markers. You'll take your yarn, and what I like to do is to wrap the yarn around the eyelet like this, and you pull the needle out and you'll have this little loop. Take this loop and it should slide easily through the eyelet. Now, in order to determine the length of yarn needed, I would take my yarn and triple the length of the row that I'll be working on, and that should be more than enough working yarn required. But for demonstration purposes, I will not be cutting off my yarn. Now, for this seam stitch, you'll take your needle and you'll insert your needle through the first and second piece through the top of the stitch, if you're working at the top of the stitch, working your needle from the front to the back, and you'll repeat this motion all the way across. it is important to maintain a good tension and an even stitch across, especially when working on the row side. Once you've completed, you should have a nice and even diagonal stitch across on one side. This stitch does not have a huge bump across like the other stitches do, and it is a fairly flat stitch seam. Now this side with the diagonal stitches, this is considered the wrong side of your work, and the other side with the horizontal stitches is considered the right side. Now before snipping off your working yarn, you'll want to weave in those ends. While you still have the needle in place, you'll insert the needle through the wrong side of your work. Typically, I like to go through 5 to 6 loops across, making sure not to go through too deep. You can always double check to see if there's any yarn poking out through the front side. And then I'll make my way back by skipping a loop. Usually it'll be the first loop on my way back, and I'll weave my needle through the opposite side. And of course, it's always ideal to use the same yarn color when doing any kind of seaming. And once you're done weaving in your ends, and if it's done correctly, you will not be able to see any of the yarn on the front side. The mattress seam is one of my favorite ways of seaming my projects together because it's also known as the invisible seam. This seam only works through the top of the stitch, and I'll show you how. First, we'll insert the yarn through our yarn needle. We'll wrap the yarn around the eyelet. We'll release the needle and insert that loop through the eyelet. Now, to determine the length of yarn we need, I would usually double the length of yarn measured against the row that I'll be working on. Now, if you have a large project, it's always ideal to place a stitch marker at the end and anywhere in the middle of your work. Now, to do the mattress stitch, first you'll want to find that first stitch and the second stitch. Here I'm going to insert the needle into the first and out through the second stitch of one piece. In this case, it'll be the back piece. Next, I'm going to go to the front piece and do the same thing. I'll insert my needle into the first and out through the second stitch. Like this, and I'll pull my yarn through. I am not tightening the stitch for now, and I'll show you in a bit why. Now we'll repeat this by going back to the back piece, and you'll insert your needle into that second stitch and out through the third. And on the opposite side, you'll find where the yarn came out from. You'll insert the needle into the second stitch and out through the third. Now for demonstration purposes, I will not be tightening up my stitch, and you can do this for at least maybe 5 to 6 stitches across. Now once you've completed about 5 to 6 stitches, go ahead and pull the top and bottom of the yarn and pull it through. And you'll be able to notice that the stitches that you just made is completely invisible. And on the wrong side, you will be able to see the stitches. Now go ahead and continue working this stitch, and don't forget to hold the yarn tightly every 5 to 6 stitches across. I've worked my way all the way till the last stitch, and as you can see, I did not pull my yarn. And let me show you how difficult it is to pull. As you can see, I'm having a bit of trouble. It's a bit tight, but doable because it's not very long. Hence, I'd advise you to always pull it every 5 to 6 stitches across. Now, as you can see, this mattress stitch is completely invisible and flat. It is also a very sturdy seam, which makes it the perfect seam for any project. Before snipping off your work, let's weave in those ends. You insert the needle through the wrong side of your work and go through about 5 to 6 loops across, making sure not to go back too deep. Then I'll make my way back by skipping the first loop and weaving in through the opposite side. A perfect seam every time. The join as you go is not a very commonly used seam, but I'll show you this as another option you can use. Just as the name says, you will join another piece as you go by either crocheting a new piece directly onto an existing piece or by working another pattern stitch to join two pieces of crochet or granny squares together. There are many ways of doing this, but let me show you one example. So for these two pieces, I'll be connecting them by working zigzag chains. Now I'll insert my hook through the corner of the stitch and I'll chain one to secure. Now for this pattern, I'll be working 3 chains. And in order to join the next piece, I'll single crochet into the next piece through that first stitch and work another 3 chains. I'll skip the next stitch of the first piece and work a single crochet and work another 3 chains. I'll repeat this pattern all the way across until my 2 pieces are completely connected. And this is just one example of how you'd work the join as you go seam stitch.